Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the shadowy corridors of power, where 13 ancient bloodlines supposedly pull the strings of everything you see, touch, and believe. You're settling into your bed right now, maybe adjusting your pillow for the 100th time, completely unaware that according to some theories, your morning coffee brand, your news feed, and even that random Netflix recommendation were all orchestrated by families whose names you've probably never heard whispered in polite conversation. Picture this while you scroll through your phone before sleep. Somewhere in a room that smells of old money and older secrets, decisions are being made that will ripple through tomorrow's headlines. You probably won't survive learning just how deep these rabbit holes go, without questioning everything you thought you knew about who really runs the show. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this global community of night owls and insomniacs gathering for these deep dives. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the entrance of a world where conspiracy meets documented history, where the line between verified fact and whispered rumor blurs like watercolors in the rain. The concept of 13 families controlling global affairs isn't just the stuff of late-night internet forums. It's a theory that's been circulating in various forms for decades, weaving together threads of legitimate historical influence with more speculative claims about coordinated global manipulation. The Rothschild name floats to the surface first, like cream in coffee, unavoidable and rich with implications. This banking dynasty, which you've probably heard mentioned in hushed tones or heated debates, genuinely did establish one of the most successful international banking networks in history. Meyer Amschel Rothschild, working from Frankfurt in the 18th century, sent his 5 sons to establish banks in major European capitals: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt itself. It's documented history that their network facilitated international trade and government financing on an unprecedented scale. But here's where things get interesting in that peculiar way that makes your brain itch. Some theorists claim the Rothschilds didn't just influence markets, they allegedly created and controlled them, orchestrating wars and economic collapses for profit. The family's actual documented wealth and influence was substantial enough that these theories found fertile ground to grow. Like mushrooms in the dark corners of historical speculation, historians still argue whether the Rothschild influence peaked in the 19th century or continues to shape global finance today. Though most mainstream economists point out that modern banking has evolved far beyond any single family's control, still, you can't deny there's something almost poetic about how money flows through generations, like water finding its way downhill, always seeking the path of least resistance and greatest return. The Rockefeller name carries similar weight. Though their empire was built on oil rather than gold, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company controlled about 90% of American oil refining by 1880, a level of market dominance that would make today's tech giants blush with envy. You're probably using products right now that trace their corporate lineage back to the Rockefeller empire. Though the connections have been obscured by decades of corporate restructuring and rebranding, what makes the Rockefeller story particularly Fascinating is how they transitioned from industrial titans to philanthropic powerhouses. The family's foundations have funded everything from medical research to educational initiatives, creating a legacy that's simultaneously celebrated and scrutinized. Some see genuine altruism, others detect a more calculating approach to social influence, using charitable giving as a tool for shaping public policy and cultural norms. The Morgan banking empire represents another pillar in this theoretical structure of financial control. J.P. Morgan's influence during the early 20th century was so significant that he essentially functioned as America's central bank before the Federal Reserve existed. When financial panic struck in 1907, it was Morgan, not the government, who organized the response that prevented total economic collapse. Imagine having that kind of power, the ability to literally save or sink an entire nation's economy with a few strategic decisions. But here's a quirky historical tidbit that might make you chuckle. J.P. Morgan was apparently terrified of having case photograph taken because he was self-conscious about his severely disfigured nose, caused by a skin condition called rhinophyma. So this titan of industry, this man who could make or break fortunes with a nod, spent considerable effort avoiding cameras. It's almost endearing. In a weird way, even the most powerful people have their insecurities and vanities. As you sink deeper into your mattress, consider how these documented historical influences have been woven into larger theories about coordinated global control. The concept of 13 specific families isn't pulled from thin air, it draws from observable patterns of intermarriage, business partnerships, and shared interests among wealthy dynasties. What transforms historical fact into conspiracy theory is the leap from these families have significant influence to these families secretly coordinate to control everything. You drift further into this labyrinth of power and influence, where the DuPont family emerges from the shadows like figures in an old daguerreotype. Their story begins with gunpowder, quite literally explosive beginnings for a dynasty that would eventually touch everything from your morning routine to the clothes on your back. Eluther Erin DuPont established his powder mills along Delaware's Brandywine Creek in 1802, and by the Civil War, his company was supplying roughly half of the gunpowder used by the Union Army. The DuPonts mastered something that modern corporations still struggle with: the art of reinvention. When the demand for gunpowder declined after World War I, they pivoted into chemicals and synthetic materials with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. You're probably surrounded by DuPont innovations right now without realizing it, coating your cookware, Kevlar protecting police officers, Lycra stretching in your workout clothes. It's almost amusing how a family that started by helping people blow things up ended up making life more comfortable and convenient. But here's where the conspiracy theorists perk up. Like cats hearing a can opener, the DuPonts didn't just adapt to changing markets, they allegedly helped shape them. Some claimed the family played a role in marijuana prohibition, not out of moral concern, but because hemp threatened their synthetic fiber profits. Whether this theory holds water is debated among historians, but it illustrates how economic interests and social policy can become uncomfortably intertwined. The Astor family represents old money in its most crystallized form, wealth so established it seems almost geological, like sedimentary layers of accumulated power. John Jacob Astor made his fortune in fur trading and real estate, becoming America's first multimillionaire. His descendants didn't just maintain wealth, they cultivated it like a rare orchid, carefully tended across generations. The Astors understood something crucial about lasting influence. It's not just about having money, it's about being indispensable to the systems that create and distribute money. Historians still argue whether the Astor influence peaked in the Gilded Age or evolved into more subtle forms of cultural and political sway. What's undeniable is their role in shaping New York's development. Vast swaths of Manhattan real estate passed through Astor hands, and their decisions about where to build and whom to lease to helped determine the city's character. You can still walk through neighborhoods that bear the invisible fingerprints of Astor planning, though few people recognize the architectural DNA embedded in the urban landscape. Here's a delightfully macabre tidbit. When the Titanic sank, John Jacob Astor Ivy went down with the ship, but not before allegedly helping his pregnant wife into a lifeboat. His body was recovered weeks later, with over $2,500 in cash still in his pockets, fortune at the time rendered utterly worthless by the cold Atlantic depths. It's a poignant reminder that even the most carefully constructed dynasties can't entirely insulate themselves from random catastrophe. The Kennedy family occupies a unique position in American consciousness, simultaneously celebrated and scrutinized, beloved and feared. Their rise from Irish immigrant roots to political royalty represents both the American dream and its potential dark side. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. built the family fortune through banking, real estate, and according to persistent rumors, bootlegging during Prohibition. Whether those rumors are true remains a subject of historical debate, but they've certainly added a layer of intrigue to the Kennedy mystique. What makes the Kennedy story particularly compelling is how tragedy seemed to shadow their success. The assassinations, the accidents, the scandals, it's as if their prominence came with a built-in curse. Some conspiracy theorists suggest these tragedies weren't random but orchestrated by competing power structures, threatened by Kennedy influence. Others point to the statistical reality that highly visible families simply attract more attention to their misfortunes, making patterns appear where none exist. You settle deeper into sleep's embrace as you consider how these family narratives interweave with broader theories about coordinated control. The concept isn't that these dynasties meet in smoke-filled rooms, plotting world domination. It's more subtle than that. It's about shared interests, overlapping investments, and the natural tendency of wealth to concentrate and self-perpetuate. When you have enough money, you don't need conspiracy. You just need convergent interests and the patience to play long-term games. The Bush family represents political dynasty in its most visible form, with 2 presidents and numerous other officials spanning multiple generations. Their connections to oil, intelligence agencies, and international business create a web of relationships that conspiracy theorists find endlessly fascinating. But here's the thing about political families: their influence is often more visible than it is coordinated. The Bush political success comes from understanding systems and building relationships, not from pulling strings behind curtains. Your consciousness drifts like smoke through the corridors of European nobility, where the Habsburg name echoes through centuries of carefully orchestrated marriages and territorial acquisitions. This family didn't just accumulate power, they practically invented the concept of strategic breeding, turning matrimony into a geopolitical chess game that would make modern diplomats weep with envy. For over 6 centuries, the Habsburgs managed to keep their grip on the Holy Roman Empire. and later the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Through a combination of political cunning and what can only be described as obsessive attention to bloodline management, the famous Habsburg jaw, that distinctive protruding lower jaw that became more pronounced with each generation, serves as a visible reminder of what happens when keeping power in the family becomes too literal. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, was so inbred that he couldn't chew his food properly and was likely infertile. It's darkly amusing that a family so focused on controlling bloodlines ultimately became victims of their own genetic strategy. But here's where things get interesting for modern conspiracy theorists. The Habsburg influence didn't simply vanish when their empires crumbled. Family members scattered across Europe, maintaining connections to banking, industry, and politics. Some researchers claim these connections form part of a broader network of European noble families who continue to wield influence through more subtle channels than direct political control. Whether this constitutes coordinated conspiracy or simply the natural networking behavior of people with shared backgrounds remains hotly debated among historians. The Warburg banking family emerges from the German financial landscape like a perfectly crafted timepiece, precise, reliable, and essential to the machinery of international commerce. Max Warburg helped establish the German Reichsbank, while his brother Paul played a crucial role in creating the Federal Reserve System in the United States. It's one of those historical coincidences that makes conspiracy theorists absolutely giddy. Brothers from the same family helping to design central banking systems on both sides of the Atlantic. What makes the Warburg story particularly fascinating is how they navigated the treacherous waters of 20th century politics. As Jewish bankers in Germany, they faced increasing persecution under Nazi rule. Yet their international connections and financial expertise made them valuable to various governments and institutions. Some family members fled to America and continued their banking careers. Others remained in Europe and faced very different fates. It's a reminder that even the most powerful families aren't immune to the broader currents of historical change. Historians still argue whether the Warburg influence on central banking represents coordinated planning or simply the natural result of expertise being recognized and utilized across different national contexts. The family's role in establishing modern monetary systems is well documented, but the interpretation of that role, beneficial expertise or manipulative, controlled, depends largely on your perspective about central banking itself. You find yourself sinking deeper into the mattress as you contemplate the Bundy family, whose name might not immediately ring bells, but whose influence on American policymaking has been substantial and persistent. McGeorge Bundy served as National Security Advisor under both Kennedy and Johnson, while his brother William was Assistant Secretary of State. Their father, Harvey Bundy, worked closely with Henry Stimson, who served as Secretary of War under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates how these influence networks operate. The Bundy family has been connected to Yale's Skull and Bones Society for generations. This secret society, which sounds like something out of a Gothic novel, has actually produced a remarkable number of influential politicians, judges, and business leaders. Whether Skull and Bones represents a genuine conspiracy or simply an elite networking club depends on your tolerance for believing that college secret. Societies can maintain relevance decades after graduation. The pattern you're noticing: families maintaining influence across multiple generations through strategic positioning in key institutions, represents what sociologists call social capital reproduction. It's not necessarily sinister. It's just how human networks naturally operate when they have sufficient resources and long-term thinking. Children of influential families grow up understanding how systems work, develop relationships with other influential families, and naturally gravitate toward positions where they can leverage these advantages. The Oppenheimer family, synonymous with diamond mining and South African industry, represents how economic control can extend far beyond national boundaries. Ernest Oppenheimer built De Beers into a global diamond monopoly that controlled roughly 90% of the world's diamond trade for decades. This wasn't achieved through conspiracy, but through aggressive business practices, strategic acquisitions, and the creation of artificial scarcity in a market for stones that are actually quite common. GEOLOGICALLY. What makes the Oppenheimer story relevant to broader theories about coordinated control is how they managed to maintain their monopoly across changing political landscapes through apartheid, international sanctions, and eventual democratic transition in South Africa. De Beers adapted its strategies while maintaining market dominance. Some theorists suggest this adaptability indicates connections to broader networks of international influence. Others point out that successful businesses naturally develop sophisticated strategies for managing political risk. Asterisk, as you drift deeper into the realm between waking and sleeping, the name Mellon surfaces like a half-remembered dream, carrying with it the weight of American industrial might and financial innovation. Andrew Mellon didn't just accumulate wealth, he practically rewrote the rules of how wealth could be accumulated, serving as Treasury Secretary under 3 presidents, while simultaneously building one of America's great fortunes through banking, oil, and aluminum. It's the kind of dual role that would trigger ethics investigations today. But in the early 20th century, the line between public service and private interest was drawn with considerably more flexibility. The Mellon family's approach to wealth preservation offers a masterclass in dynastic thinking. Rather than simply hoarding money, they invested in institutions, universities, museums, foundations that would ensure their influence persisted long after the original fortune builders were gone. The National Gallery of Art in Washington exists because Andrew Mellon understood that cultural institutions provide a form of immortality that stock portfolios simply can't match. You've probably walked through spaces funded by Mellon money without realizing you were experiencing a form of philanthropic legacy planning. Here's a deliciously ironic tidbit. Andrew Mellon, who served as Treasury Secretary during Prohibition, was simultaneously one of the largest shareholders in a company that produced industrial alcohol. While publicly supporting the ban on drinking, he was privately profiting from one of the few legal forms of alcohol production. It's the kind of contradiction that makes you wonder whether moral positions and economic interests can ever be completely separated, even in the most principled individuals. The Onassis name conjures images of Mediterranean luxury and tragic glamour. But Aristotle Onassis, rise from refugee to shipping magnate, represents something more complex than simple wealth accumulation. His fleet of oil tankers helped reshape global energy transportation, while his marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy created symbolic connections between Greek shipping money and American political royalty. Onassis understood that in the modern world, influence flows not just through official channels, but through cultural symbolism and media attention. What makes the Onassis story particularly relevant to theories about coordinated elite control is how seamlessly he moved between different spheres of influence: business, politics, entertainment, international diplomacy. His relationships with figures like Winston Churchill, Maria Callas, and various heads of state created a web of connections that transcended traditional categories. Whether this represents calculated networking or simply the natural social patterns of extremely wealthy individuals remains a subject of historical debate. Historians still argue whether Onassis's influence peaked with his shipping empire or evolved into more subtle forms through his cultural and political connections. What's undeniable is his role in demonstrating how modern wealth operates, not through direct control, but through the ability to move seamlessly between different worlds and create unexpected alliances. The Getty family fortune, built on oil and preserved through art, represents another variation on the theme of dynastic influence. J. Paul Getty's obsessive focus on cost control. He famously installed a payphone in his English mansion for guests to use, created a business empire that prioritized long-term accumulation over short-term comfort. His descendants have channeled this wealth into cultural institutions, creating the Getty Center and Getty Museum, which have become significant forces in the art world. But here's where the Getty story takes a darker turn that conspiracy theorists find particularly compelling. The family has been plagued by kidnappings, mysterious deaths, and internal conflicts that read like a soap opera written by Edgar Allan Poe. When J. Paul Getty III was kidnapped in Italy, his grandfather initially refused to pay ransom, reportedly saying he had 14 other grandchildren and didn't want to encourage copycat crimes. The kidnappers eventually cut off the boy's ear and mailed it to a newspaper to prove their seriousness. Some theorists suggest these tragedies weren't random but orchestrated by competing power structures or criminal organizations seeking to pressure the family. Others point out that extreme wealth naturally attracts extreme attention from criminals, and that the Getty tragedies, while horrific, don't necessarily indicate broader conspiracies. The truth probably lies somewhere between these interpretations. Wealth of this magnitude creates its own gravitational field of risk and opportunity. You feel your breathing slow as you consider how these family stories interconnect with broader patterns of influence and control. The concept of 13 families controlling everything isn't necessarily about formal coordination. It's about how wealth, maintained across generations, creates persistent influence networks that operate through both official and unofficial channels. These families don't need to meet in secret rooms because their interests, naturally, align around preserving and expanding the systems that created their wealth. The Agnelli family, synonymous with Fiat automobiles and Italian industrial power, represents how dynastic influence operates in the modern corporate world. Gianni Agnelli wasn't just a businessman. He was a cultural icon who understood that, in the age of mass media, style and symbolism could be as important as balance sheets and profit margins. His influence extended far beyond automotive manufacturing into media, politics, and international relations. Your mind wanders through the misty corridors of historical influence as the name Sassoon emerges like an exotic perfume, carrying with it tales of opium fortunes and international intrigue that span continents and centuries. The Sassoon family built their wealth on the opium trade between India and China, becoming known as the Rothschilds of the East for their sophisticated international banking and trading networks. David Sassoon established trading posts from Bombay to Shanghai, creating a commercial empire that moved seamlessly between British colonial administration and Chinese imperial bureaucracy. What makes the Sassoon story particularly fascinating is how they navigated the moral complexities of their era while building lasting institutions. Yes, their fortune was built on opium, a trade that modern sensibilities rightfully condemn, but they also became major philanthropists, funding hospitals, schools, and cultural institutions across Asia and Europe. It's one of those historical contradictions that makes you wonder whether moral progress is possible within systems that are fundamentally exploitative, or whether philanthropy can ever truly wash clean the sources of questionable wealth. The family's transition from opium traders to respected members of British society illustrates how wealth, given enough time and careful management, can transform its own narrative. By the early 20th century, Sassoons were being knighted, marrying into British aristocracy, and serving in Parliament. Some conspiracy theorists see this transformation as evidence of how criminal enterprises can legitimize themselves through patient cultivation of political connections. Others argue it simply demonstrates the natural evolution of successful merchant families. Here's a quirky detail that humanizes this grand narrative. Siegfried Sassoon, the famous World War I poet and descendant of the trading dynasty, became a vocal critic of the war despite serving as an officer. His poem, The General, contains the bitterly ironic lines about soldiers who did for him with his plan of attack. It's almost poetic justice that a family fortune built on one form of human suffering produced an artist who eloquently protested another. The Schiff family represents another strand in the complex web of international banking that conspiracy theorists find endlessly fascinating. Jacob Schiff, working through the investment firm Kuhn, Loeb & Co., helped finance the expansion of American railroads and played a crucial role in funding Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. His decision to support Japan wasn't based on geopolitical strategy, but on his opposition to Russian anti-Semitic policies. Reminder that even global financial decisions can have deeply personal motivations. Historians still argue whether Schiff's influence on early 20th century international relations represents calculated manipulation or simply the natural result of having capital available when nations needed financing. What's documented is his role in facilitating massive infrastructure projects and international conflicts through strategic lending. Whether this constitutes beneficial economic development or manipulative control depends largely on your perspective about the role of private capital in public affairs. The Schiff family story also illustrates how Jewish banking families became lightning rods for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Their genuine influence in international finance provided a factual foundation that anti-Semitic propagandists could exploit and distort. This historical pattern where real influence becomes the basis for exaggerated and malicious theories helps explain why discussions of banking dynasties often attract both legitimate historical inquiry and dangerous prejudice. As you sink deeper into the soft embrace of your pillow, consider how the Lehman Brothers dynasty fits into this broader narrative of financial influence. Founded by 3 German immigrant brothers in Alabama, Lehman Brothers grew from a small cotton trading business into one of Wall Street's most powerful investment banks. Their story spans American history from the antebellum South through the 2008 financial crisis. When the firm's collapse helped trigger a global economic meltdown. The Lehman family's evolution from Southern merchants to Wall Street titans illustrates how American capitalism rewards adaptability and risk-taking. They survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, and numerous market crashes by constantly reinventing their business model. Their eventual collapse in 2008 wasn't due to external conspiracy, but to internal risk management failures and the broader instabilities of modern financial markets. What makes the Lehman story relevant to theories about coordinated elite control is how their collapse rippled through the global financial system, the interconnectedness that allowed one firm's failure to threaten the entire world. Economy suggests either remarkable coordination among financial institutions or dangerous systemic vulnerabilities that no single entity controls. Most economists favor the latter interpretation, but conspiracy theorists often prefer the former. The Harriman family represents American railroad money transformed into political influence across multiple generations. Edward Harriman built a railroad empire that spanned the continent, while his son Averell became a diplomat and politician who served under both Democratic and Republican administrations. The family's transition from transportation magnates to foreign policy experts illustrates how American dynasties have adapted to changing sources of power and influence. Here's a detail that might make you chuckle. E.H. Harriman was so obsessed with efficiency that he once fired a railroad employee for taking too long to oil a locomotive, then personally demonstrated the correct technique. Imagine being so wealthy and powerful that you have strong opinions about locomotive maintenance procedures. It's the kind of micromanagement that would drive modern employees to quit, but apparently helped build one of America's great fortunes. Asterisk, you drift further into the twilight realm where historical fact blends with whispered speculation, and the name Vanderbilt surfaces like a ghost ship emerging from fog. Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't just build a transportation empire. He practically invented the concept of American industrial monopoly, moving from steamboats to railroads with the ruthless efficiency of a chess grandmaster who sees 20 moves ahead. By the time of his death, he controlled most of the railroad lines connecting New York to the Great Lakes, creating a transportation network that made him the richest man in America. The Vanderbilt approach to wealth accumulation was refreshingly direct. Identify essential services, gain control of them, then charge whatever the market would bear. No elaborate conspiracies or secret meetings, just old-fashioned monopolistic capitalism practiced with artistic precision. Cornelius famously said, "Law? What do I care about law? Hain't I got the power?" It's the kind of blunt honesty about wealth and influence that modern billionaires probably think but rarely say in public. What makes the Vanderbilt story particularly relevant to modern theories about elite control is how quickly their influence evaporated. Within a few generations, the family fortune was largely dissipated through lavish spending and poor investment decisions. The Vanderbilt mansions became museums. Their railroad empire was absorbed by other companies, and their political influence faded into historical footnote. It's a reminder that even the most carefully constructed dynasties can crumble if they lose focus on the fundamentals of wealth preservation. Here's a deliciously ironic detail. Gloria Vanderbilt, great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore, became famous not for inheriting vast wealth, but for designing blue jeans. The family that once controlled America's transportation infrastructure ended up in the fashion business, selling denim to the masses. It's almost poetic, from moving people across the continent to clothing their backsides. The Astor name resurfaces in your drowsy contemplation, but this time through the British branch of the family tree. Nancy Astor became the first woman to sit in the British House of Commons, using her position to advocate for various social causes while maintaining the family's tradition of political influence. Her salon at Cliveden became a gathering place for politicians, intellectuals, and social reformers, the kind of informal institution where real influence often operates more effectively than formal political processes. Some historians argue that the Cliveden set, as Nancy Astor's circle became known, played a significant role in shaping British foreign policy during the 1930s. Others suggest their influence has been exaggerated by both supporters and critics. What's undeniable is that wealthy hostesses like Nancy Astor created spaces where political figures could meet informally, discuss sensitive topics, and build the personal relationships that often determine policy outcomes. The British Astor also illustrate how dynastic influence can persist across national boundaries and political systems. American money became British political power, which then influenced international relations during some of the 20th century's most crucial moments. Whether this represents coordinated planning or simply the natural networking behavior of internationally connected families remains a subject of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Astor influence on British politics peaked in the interwar period or continued through more subtle channels in subsequent decades. What's clear is that the family understood something crucial about modern influence. It operates through relationships and institutions rather than direct control, and it requires constant cultivation to remain effective as your breathing deepens and your muscles relax. Consider how the Hearst media empire fits into broader patterns of information control and public opinion manipulation. William Randolph Hearst built a newspaper and magazine empire that shaped American public opinion for decades, pioneering techniques of sensationalistic journalism that modern media still employs. His famous alleged instruction to a photographer in Cuba, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war," may be apocryphal, but it captures the essence of how media power can influence political events. The Hearst story is particularly relevant to modern conspiracy theories because it demonstrates how media control can be used to shape public perception of reality. Hearst's newspapers didn't just report news, they created news, promoted political candidates, and influenced public policy through strategic coverage and editorial positioning. Whether this represents legitimate journalism or manipulative propaganda often depends on whether you agree with the positions being promoted. What makes the Hearst legacy particularly complex is how it evolved across generations. The family maintained control of their media properties while adapting to changing technologies and audience preferences. Today's Hearst Corporation operates magazines, television stations, and digital properties that continue to influence public opinion, though in more subtle ways than the yellow journalism of William Randolph's era. The transition from newspapers to multimedia conglomerates illustrates how dynastic influence adapts to technological change. The Hearst family didn't just preserve their wealth, they transformed it to remain relevant in new media landscapes. Whether this represents natural business evolution or calculated influence preservation depends on your perspective about the relationship between media ownership and public opinion manipulation. Asterisk. Your consciousness floats like a leaf on still water as you contemplate the Thyssen industrial dynasty, whose name might not immediately register, but whose influence on 20th century history runs deeper than most people realize. Fritz Thyssen built a German steel empire that became essential to the country's industrial development. But his story takes a dark turn that illustrates how even the most successful dynasties can become entangled in historical catastrophes they helped create. Thyssen initially supported the Nazi Party, believing he could use their political power to advance his business interests while controlling their more extreme tendencies. It's a classic example of how wealthy individuals often assume they can manipulate political movements without being consumed by them. By 1938, Thyssen realized his mistake and fled Germany, but not before his steel plants had helped arm the Wehrmacht and his financial support had helped legitimize Hitler's rise to power. The Thyssen story offers a sobering reminder that conspiracy theories about elite control often underestimate how chaotic and unpredictable historical forces can be. Even the most powerful families can find themselves swept along by events they thought they could control. Fritz Thyssen ended up in a concentration camp not because he opposed the Nazis from the beginning, but because he tried to withdraw his support when their true nature became clear. Here's a detail that might make you reflect on the complexity of historical judgment. After the war, Thyssen wrote a book titled I Paid Hitler, in which he attempted to explain and justify his early support for the Nazi Party, whether this represents genuine remorse or calculated reputation. Management remains debated among historians. It's one of those moral ambiguities that resists simple categorization. Was he a victim of his own miscalculation or a war criminal seeking rehabilitation? The post-war Thyssen family illustrates how dynastic wealth can survive even the most catastrophic historical disruptions. The family's industrial assets were eventually restored, their business empire rebuilt, and their influence gradually rehabilitated. Some conspiracy theorists see this recovery as evidence of coordinated protection by international elite networks. Others point out that industrial capacity and technical expertise remain valuable regardless of their owners' past political mistakes. As you sink deeper into the soft embrace of sleep, the name Wallenberg emerges from Swedish banking history, like a figure from a Nordic saga. The Wallenberg family has controlled Sweden's largest investment bank for over 150 years, maintaining influence through a combination of financial acumen and strategic political positioning that has survived wars, revolutions, and economic upheavals that destroyed other dynastic fortunes. What makes the Wallenberg story particularly fascinating is how they've managed to maintain control while operating in a democratic socialist country that theoretically opposes concentrated wealth and power. Their success illustrates how skilled dynasties can adapt to any political environment by making themselves indispensable to the systems they operate within. The Wallenbergs didn't fight Swedish social democracy, they found ways to work with it and profit from it. The family's most famous member, Raoul Wallenberg, used his diplomatic position to save thousands of Hungarian Jews during World War II, issuing protective passports and sheltering refugees in buildings he designated as Swedish territory. His eventual disappearance in Soviet custody remains one of the war's unsolved mysteries, but his humanitarian actions demonstrate how individual family members can transcend their dynastic roles to make genuinely heroic choices. Historians still argue whether Raoul Wallenberg was acting independently or as part of a broader family strategy to position themselves favorably with allied powers. What's undeniable is that his actions saved lives and created a positive legacy that has helped protect the family's reputation and influence in subsequent decades. Whether this represents calculated reputation management or genuine moral courage probably depends on your cynicism about human motivations. The modern Wallenberg Empire operates through a complex web of holding companies, foundations, and investment vehicles that control significant portions of Swedish industry while maintaining relatively low public profiles. Some researchers suggest this structure represents a model for how modern dynastic influence operates, through institutional control rather than personal visibility, through patient capital allocation rather than dramatic public gestures. The Pritzker family represents American entrepreneurial success, transformed into political influence across multiple generations. J.A. Pritzker built a business empire spanning hotels, manufacturing, and financial services, while his descendants have moved into politics, philanthropy, and cultural institutions. The family's Hyatt hotel chain alone demonstrates how service industry success can create the foundation for broader social influence. What makes the Pritzker story particularly relevant to theories about coordinated elite influence is how seamlessly family members have moved between business and government roles. Penny Pritzker served as Secretary of Commerce under Barack Obama, while J.B. Pritzker became governor of Illinois. Whether this represents natural progression from business success to public service or calculated positioning for broader influence remains a subject of political debate. Here's a quirky detail that humanizes this narrative of power and influence. The Pritzker family has been involved in numerous lawsuits among themselves over inheritance and business control issues. Even the most successful dynasties aren't immune to the kind of family squabbles that would be familiar to anyone who's ever argued about holiday dinner arrangements. It's reassuring, in a way, to know that vast wealth doesn't eliminate the fundamental human tendency towards sibling rivalry and generational conflict. You drift deeper into the realm where documented history meets whispered speculation, and the name Warburg resurfaces like a familiar melody played in a different key. This time, you're considering not just their banking influence, but their role in what some theorists call the migration of power. How influential families maintain their positions even as the centers of global power shift from continent to continent, from empire to empire. The Warburg family's ability to maintain influence across the collapse of the German Empire, the rise of Nazi Germany, the emergence of American hegemony, and the creation of the European Union illustrates something crucial about dynastic survival. Adaptability trumps ideology every time, while political movements rise and fall based on rigid principles. Successful dynasties flow like water, finding new channels when old ones become blocked. Max Warburg's son, Erich, became a prominent botanist rather than following the family banking tradition. Yet even this apparent departure from dynastic expectations served the family's broader interests. His scientific reputation provided social legitimacy and cultural capital that complemented his relatives' financial influence. It's a reminder that dynastic power often operates through diversification. Not every family member needs to be a banker if some become scientists, artists, or philanthropists who enhance the family's overall social position. Here's a detail that might make you smile in your drowsy state. During World War II, American intelligence services recruited several Warburg family members precisely because of their international connections and financial expertise. The same networks that conspiracy theorists view with suspicion were actually valuable to Allied intelligence efforts. It's one of those historical ironies that make simple narratives about good and evil frustratingly complicated. The Warburg influence illustrates how modern dynastic power operates through institutional rather than personal channels. Rather than individual family members wielding direct political control, the Warburg name became associated with think tanks, foundations, and policy institutes that shape public discourse and government decision-making. Whether this represents more sophisticated manipulation or simply the natural evolution of how expertise influences policy depends on your perspective about the relationship between knowledge and power. As your breathing slows and your mind drifts toward sleep, consider how the Loeb family fits into this broader tapestry of financial influence. Solomon Loeb's investment banking firm, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., became one of Wall Street's most powerful institutions, financing railroad development and industrial expansion across America. The firm's influence peaked during the early 20th century, when it rivaled J.P. Morgan and Co. in terms of capital deployment and political connections. What makes the Loeb story particularly interesting is how it illustrates the intersection of Jewish immigrant success and American economic development. Solomon Loeb arrived in America with little money but considerable financial expertise, building a business empire that helped fund the infrastructure projects that transformed the United States into an industrial powerhouse. Whether this represents successful assimilation or calculated infiltration depends largely on your attitude toward immigration and economic development. The Loeb family's transition from investment banking to philanthropy and cultural patronage follows a familiar pattern among American dynasties. As direct business influence becomes more regulated and scrutinized, wealthy families often shift their focus toward charitable foundations and cultural institutions that provide different forms of social influence. The Loeb Classical Library, which makes ancient texts accessible to modern readers, represents this kind of cultural investment that creates lasting influence beyond immediate financial returns. Historians still argue whether the Loeb influence on American financial development represents beneficial expertise or manipulative control. But what's undeniable is their role in creating the capital markets that enabled American industrial expansion. Whether you view this as patriotic contribution or foreign manipulation probably depends on your broader attitudes about immigration, capitalism, and cultural change. The Kuhn family, partners with the Loebs in their banking enterprise, represents another strand in the complex web of German-Jewish financial influence in America. Abraham Kuhn's partnership with Solomon Loeb created one of the most successful investment banking firms in American history, demonstrating how immigrant communities often succeed through strategic partnerships that combine complementary skills and resources. What conspiracy theorists find particularly intriguing about Kuhn, Loeb & Co. is how the firm's influence extended beyond simple financial services into railroad development, industrial consolidation, and government financing. The firm helped fund the Union Pacific Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and numerous other infrastructure projects that shaped American economic development. Whether this represents beneficial capital allocation or manipulative control over essential services remains debated among economic historians. Here's a quirky detail that illustrates how these financial networks operated. Otto Kahn, a partner in Kuhn, Loeb & Co., became one of America's leading arts patrons, funding opera companies, symphony orchestras, and theatrical productions. His cultural activities weren't separate from his business interests, they were part of a broader strategy for building social influence and political connections. It's a reminder that dynastic power often operates through cultural as well as economic channels. The transition from Kuhn, Loeb and Co. to modern investment banking illustrates how financial influence adapts to changing regulatory environments and market conditions. The firm was eventually absorbed by Lehman Brothers, which was itself later absorbed by other institutions. But the networks and relationships established by the original partners continued to influence American finance long after the firm's name disappeared from Wall Street. You feel your muscles relaxing as you contemplate how these individual family stories connect to broader theories about coordinated elite control. The pattern that emerges isn't one of explicit conspiracy, but of convergent interests, wealthy families naturally developing similar strategies for preserving and expanding their influence, creating networks that appear coordinated even when they're simply following parallel paths towards similar goals. Your consciousness drifts like morning mist through the landscape of modern corporate power, where the name Coke surfaces with the weight of contemporary controversy and historical complexity. Fred Koch built his fortune in oil refining, but not without controversy. His early business included building refineries for Stalin's Soviet Union, a detail that adds ironic complexity to his son's later advocacy for free market capitalism. It's one of those historical contradictions that make simple political narratives frustratingly inadequate. The Koch brothers, Charles and David, transformed their inherited oil fortune into a political influence machine that has reshaped American conservative politics over the past several decades. Their network of think tanks, advocacy groups, and political action committees represents a modern approach to dynastic influence that operates through ideological rather than purely economic channels, whether this represents legitimate political participation or manipulative control over democratic processes remains hotly debated in American politics. What makes the Koch story particularly relevant to theories about elite coordination is how they've built networks that extend far beyond their immediate family interests. Their political activities have created alliances with other wealthy families and corporate interests, forming what some observers describe as a donor class that exercises disproportionate influence over American policymaking. Whether this represents natural political coalition building or coordinated manipulation depends largely on your perspective about the role of money in democratic politics. Here's a detail that might make you chuckle. David Koch once ran for vice president on the Libertarian Party ticket, receiving about 1% of the national vote. Imagine being so wealthy that you can afford to run for national office as a hobby, knowing you have no realistic chance of winning. It's the kind of political vanity project that only becomes possible when you have more money than you could spend in several lifetimes. The Koch political network illustrates how modern dynastic influence operates through institutional rather than personal channels, rather than individual family members seeking elected office. The Koch approach involves funding organizations that shape public policy debates, support preferred candidates, and influence electoral outcomes. Whether this represents more sophisticated democracy or more subtle manipulation depends on your attitude toward the relationship between wealth and political power. As you sink deeper into the soft embrace of your pillow, consider how the Adelson family represents another variation on the theme of modern dynastic political influence. Sheldon Adelson built a casino empire that made him one of America's wealthiest individuals, then used that wealth to become one of the Republican Party's most significant donors. His political activities extended beyond domestic American politics to include substantial support for Israeli causes and politicians. The Adelson story illustrates how modern wealth can transcend national boundaries in ways that would have been impossible for earlier dynasties. His simultaneous influence in American and Israeli politics demonstrates how globalized wealth creates new forms of international political networking, whether this represents beneficial international cooperation or problematic. Foreign influence in domestic politics remains a subject of ongoing political debate. What conspiracy theorists find particularly intriguing about the Adelson influence is how it connects American domestic politics to Middle Eastern geopolitics through the mechanism of campaign contributions and political advocacy. His support for specific policies regarding Israel and Iran helped shape American foreign policy in ways that extended far beyond his immediate business interests. Whether this represents legitimate political participation or inappropriate foreign influence depends largely on your perspective about the relationship between campaign contributions and policy outcomes. Historians still argue whether the age influence represents a new form of dynastic political power or simply the natural result of how democratic politics operates in an era of concentrated wealth. What's undeniable is his role in demonstrating how individual donors can significantly influence electoral outcomes and policy decisions through strategic campaign contributions and political advocacy. The Mercer family represents yet another variation on the theme of modern dynastic political influence. Though their approach differs significantly from both the Kochs and the Adelson, Robert Mercer made his fortune through hedge fund management and algorithmic trading, then used that wealth to support political candidates and causes that aligned with his ideological preferences. His daughter Rebecca became a significant figure in conservative political circles, demonstrating how dynastic influence can operate across generations, even within relatively new fortunes. What makes the Mercer story particularly relevant to contemporary political debates is their involvement in data analytics and digital political advertising. Their financial support for Cambridge Analytica and similar organizations represents a new frontier in political influence, using sophisticated data analysis and targeted advertising to influence voter behavior in ways that traditional political advertising cannot match. Here's a detail that illustrates how modern political influence operates. The Mercer family's political activities included funding Breitbart News, supporting Steve Bannon's political career, and backing Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. Their influence operated through media, political consulting, and direct candidate support, a multi-channel approach that demonstrates how modern dynastic political power requires diversified strategies rather than single-focus efforts. The Mercer political network also illustrates how technological expertise can become a form of political power. Robert Mercer's background in computer science and algorithmic trading provided insights into data analysis and pattern recognition that proved valuable in political contexts. Whether this represents beneficial innovation or manipulative exploitation of democratic vulnerabilities remains debated among political scientists and technology experts. You feel your breathing deepen as you contemplate how these modern examples of dynastic political influence connect to broader theories about coordinated, elite control. The pattern that emerges suggests not explicit conspiracy but convergent strategies, wealthy families independently developing similar approaches to political influence that create networks of mutual support and shared interests. Asterisk, your mind drifts through the corridors of Silicon Valley power, where new dynasties are forming with the speed of fiber optic connections and the subtlety of algorithmic manipulation. The name Zuckerberg might not yet carry the historical weight of Rothschild or Rockefeller, but Mark Zuckerberg's control over Facebook now represents a new form of dynastic influence that operates through information control rather than traditional financial or political channels. What makes the emerging tech dynasties particularly fascinating is how they've compressed the timeline of influence accumulation, where traditional dynasties require generations to build lasting power. Tech entrepreneurs have created global influence networks within single lifetimes. Zuckerberg's ability to shape how billions of people communicate, share information, and perceive reality represents a form of power that previous dynasties could only dream of achieving. The Facebook empire illustrates how modern influence operates through platform control rather than direct ownership of traditional assets. Zuckerberg doesn't need to own newspapers or television stations when he controls the algorithms that determine what information billions of people see every day. Whether this represents innovative communication technology or manipulative information control depends largely on your perspective about the relationship between technology and democracy. Here's a detail that might make you reflect on the nature of modern power. Zuckerberg's congressional testimony about Facebook's role in political advertising and election interference was watched by millions of people. Yet the senators questioning him often seemed to understand less about the technology than the average teenager. It's a reminder that traditional political institutions often struggle to regulate forms of power they don't fully comprehend. The Zuckerberg influence also extends beyond Facebook to include Instagram, WhatsApp, and various virtual reality initiatives that could shape how future generations interact with digital environments. Whether this represents beneficial technological innovation or dangerous concentration of communication control remains hotly debated among technology policy experts and digital rights advocates. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, consider how the Bezos empire represents another variation on the theme of modern dynastic power. Jeff Bezos built Amazon from an online bookstore into a global commerce and cloud computing empire that touches virtually every aspect of modern economic life. His simultaneous ownership of the Washington Post demonstrates how tech wealth can be converted into traditional media influence, creating hybrid forms of power that combine old and new influence channels. The Amazon empire's reach extends far beyond simple retail commerce into cloud computing services that power much of the internet, logistics networks that enable global trade, and artificial intelligence systems that increasingly make decisions about what products people see and purchase. Whether this represents beneficial economic efficiency or dangerous market concentration remains debated among economists and antitrust regulators. What conspiracy theorists find particularly intriguing about the Bezos influence is how Amazon's cloud computing services host websites and applications for government agencies, creating potential conflicts between private corporate interests and public sector needs. The company's contracts with the CIA and other intelligence agencies raise questions about the relationship between tech platforms and government, surveillance that previous dynasties never had to navigate. Historians still argue whether the tech dynasties represent fundamentally new forms of power or simply traditional influence, patterns adapted to digital environments. What's undeniable is their role in creating new forms of economic and social control that operate through voluntary participation rather than direct coercion. People choose to use Facebook and Amazon, even as these platforms accumulate unprecedented amounts of data about their users, behaviors, and preferences. The Gates dynasty represents, perhaps, the most successful example of how tech wealth can be transformed into global influence through philanthropic activities. Bill Gates's transition from Microsoft founder to global health advocate demonstrates how modern dynasties can maintain influence even after stepping back from direct business control. The Gates Foundation's role in global health initiatives, education reform, and climate change advocacy represents a new model for how private wealth can shape public policy on a global scale. What makes the Gates influence particularly complex is how it operates through charitable giving rather than traditional political or economic channels. The foundation's funding decisions can determine which health problems receive research attention, which educational approaches get implemented, and which climate solutions receive development resources. Whether this represents beneficial philanthropy or inappropriate private control over public goods remains debated among development experts and democratic theorists. Here's a detail that illustrates the complexity of modern philanthropic influence. The Gates Foundation's support for specific approaches to malaria prevention has helped save millions of lives, but it has also influenced how global health organizations prioritize their resources and research efforts. The same funding that produces beneficial health outcomes also shapes the broader landscape of global health policy in ways that reflect the Foundation's priorities rather than democratic decision-making processes. The transition from Microsoft to philanthropic influence also demonstrates how modern dynasties can maintain power across changing technological and political environments. Gates's influence on global health policy may ultimately prove more lasting and significant than his role in personal computer development, illustrating how successful dynasties adapt their strategies to remain relevant across different historical periods. The transition from Microsoft to philanthropic influence also demonstrates how modern dynasties can maintain power across changing technological and political environments. Gates's influence on global health policy may ultimately prove more lasting and significant than his role in personal computer development, illustrating how successful dynasties adapt their strategies to remain relevant across different historical periods. You feel your muscles relaxing as you contemplate how these emerging tech dynasties connect to broader theories about coordinated elite control. The pattern suggests not explicit conspiracy, but convergent evolution, different entrepreneurs independently developing similar strategies for converting technological innovation into lasting social influence, creating networks that appear coordinated, even when they're simply following parallel paths towards similar goals. Your awareness floats through the intersection of old money and new power, where traditional dynastic families have learned to adapt their influence strategies to the digital age. The name Murdoch carries the weight of media empire building that spans continents and decades. But Rupert Murdoch's approach to information control represents something more sophisticated than simple newspaper ownership. His media properties, from the Times of London to Fox News to the Wall Street Journal, create what media scholars call an information ecosystem that shapes public discourse across multiple platforms and political perspectives. What makes the Murdoch empire particularly relevant to theories about coordinated influence is how it operates across national boundaries while adapting to local political environments. His media properties support conservative politicians in America, Australia, and Britain, but the specific policy positions they advocate vary based on local political contexts. Whether this represents coordinated global influence or simply successful business adaptation to different markets remains debated among media analysts and political scientists. The Murdoch family's transition across generations illustrates how modern dynasties manage succession in an era of rapid technological change. Rupert's children have taken different approaches to media influence, some focusing on traditional broadcasting, others on digital platforms, still others on entertainment content. Whether this represents strategic diversification or natural family evolution depends on your perspective about how dynastic planning operates in practice. Here's a detail that might make you smile. Despite building a global media empire, Rupert Murdoch reportedly still reads multiple newspapers every morning in physical print format, marking them up with a red pen like an old-fashioned newspaper editor. It's a reminder that even the most technologically sophisticated media moguls often maintain personal habits that reflect their generational origins and professional training. The Murdoch influence also extends beyond traditional media into digital platforms, streaming services, and social media networks that reach audiences traditional newspapers and television stations cannot access. Whether this represents natural business evolution or calculated expansion of information control capabilities remains a subject of ongoing regulatory and academic scrutiny. As you drift deeper toward sleep, consider how the Bloomberg media and financial empire represents another variation on the theme of information-based dynastic power. Michael Bloomberg built his fortune by creating financial information systems that became essential infrastructure for global trading and investment decisions. His transition from financial data to news media to political office demonstrates how information control can be converted into different forms of social influence. The Bloomberg empire illustrates how modern influence operates through the provision of essential services rather than direct ownership of traditional assets. Bloomberg terminals became so integral to financial markets that traders and investors worldwide depend on Bloomberg data to make decisions worth trillions of dollars. Whether this represents beneficial market efficiency or dangerous information monopolization depends largely on your perspective about the relationship between information access and market fairness. Bloomberg's mayoral tenure in New York City demonstrates how business success can be converted into political influence, while his subsequent presidential campaign illustrates the limits of that conversion. His ability to self-fund a national political campaign while maintaining media properties that covered his candidacy raised questions about the relationship between media ownership and democratic participation that previous dynasties never had to navigate. Historians still argue whether the Bloomberg influence represents a new form of technocratic governance or simply traditional elite power adapted to information age realities. What's undeniable is his role in demonstrating how financial expertise and media control can be combined to create hybrid forms of influence that operate across business, media, and political spheres simultaneously. The Soros Influence Network represents perhaps the most controversial example of how modern dynastic wealth can be converted into global political influence through strategic philanthropy and advocacy funding. George Soros built his fortune through currency speculation and hedge fund management, then used that wealth to support democratic movements, human rights organizations, and progressive political causes around the world. What makes the Soros influence particularly complex is how it operates through a network of foundations, think tanks, and advocacy organizations that promote specific political and social changes rather than simply preserving existing power structures. His open society foundations have supported everything from drug policy reform to voting rights advocacy to international development programs, creating a global network of organizations that share similar ideological perspectives. The Soros Network also illustrates how modern dynastic influence can become a lightning rod for conspiracy theories that blend legitimate criticism with anti-Semitic prejudice and nationalist resentment. His support for international organizations and transnational advocacy groups has made him a target for politicians and commentators who view globalization and international cooperation with suspicion. Here's a detail that demonstrates the complexity of modern philanthropic influence. Soros's support for criminal justice reform in the United States has included funding for district attorney candidates who support alternatives to traditional prosecution approaches. Whether this represents beneficial democratic participation or inappropriate manipulation of local elections depends largely on your perspective about the role of money in political campaigns and the legitimacy of prosecutorial discretion. The Soros Influence Network also extends beyond American domestic politics to include support for democratic movements in Eastern Europe, human rights organizations in authoritarian countries, and international advocacy groups that promote various social and political changes. Whether this represents beneficial support for human rights or inappropriate foreign interference in domestic politics remains hotly debated among foreign policy experts and sovereignty advocates. You feel your breathing slow as you contemplate how these modern examples of information-based and advocacy-focused dynastic influence connect to broader theories about coordinated elite control. The pattern that emerges suggests not explicit conspiracy but strategic adaptation. Wealthy families learning to exercise influence through information control, philanthropic advocacy, and global networking rather than traditional economic or political domination. Asterisk. Your mind drifts through the shadowy realm where documented influence meets speculative coordination, and you find yourself contemplating the mechanisms through which these various dynastic networks might actually intersect and collaborate. The concept of the World Economic Forum emerges like a crystalline structure in your drowsy consciousness, not quite conspiracy, not quite coincidence, but something more subtle and complex than either simple explanation can capture. Klaus Schwab's creation of the World Economic Forum in 1971 established what has become the most visible platform for global elite networking, where political leaders, business executives, and cultural influencers gather annually in Davos to discuss economic trends and policy coordination. Whether this represents beneficial international cooperation or coordinated manipulation of global affairs depends largely on your perspective about the legitimacy of informal international governance mechanisms. The forum's evolution from academic conference to global influence platform illustrates how modern elite coordination operates through institutional rather than conspiratorial channels. The annual meetings provide opportunities for relationship building, policy discussion, and strategic coordination that would be difficult to achieve through traditional diplomatic or business channels. Whether this represents efficient problem-solving or undemocratic governance remains hotly debated among political scientists and sovereignty advocates. What makes the World Economic Forum particularly relevant to theories about dynastic coordination is how it brings together representatives from many of the families and institutions we've been discussing: Rothschild advisors, Rockefeller Foundation officials, tech industry leaders, and media moguls all participate in forum activities, creating opportunities for the kind of informal coordination that conspiracy theorists find deeply suspicious. Here's a detail that might make you reflect on the nature of modern influence. The forum's Young Global Leaders program has included future political leaders like Emmanuel Macron, Justin Trudeau, and Jacinda Ardern among its participants. Whether this represents beneficial leadership development or coordinated cultivation of political influence depends on your perspective about the relationship between international networking and democratic sovereignty. The forum's promotion of concepts like stakeholder capitalism and the Great Reset demonstrates how modern elite influence operates through ideological rather than purely economic channels. These concepts shape how business leaders, political figures, and media commentators think about economic policy and social organization, creating intellectual frameworks that influence decision-making across multiple institutions and countries. As you sink deeper into the soft embrace of sleep, consider how the Bilderberg Group represents another node in the network of elite coordination mechanisms. Founded in 1954, the annual Bilderberg meetings bring together approximately 150 political leaders, business executives, and intellectuals for private discussions about economic and political issues. The meetings' secrecy and exclusivity have made them a particular focus for conspiracy theorists. Though participants insist the discussions are simply informal policy conversations rather than coordinated planning sessions. The Bilderberg Group's membership over the decades has included representatives from many of the dynastic families and institutions we've discussed, creating opportunities for the kind of relationship building and strategic coordination that could theoretically enable coordinated influence without requiring explicit conspiracy. Whether these meetings represent beneficial policy discussion or inappropriate coordination of elite interests remains debated among political observers and democratic theorists. What conspiracy theorists find particularly intriguing about Bilderberg is how policy ideas discussed at the meetings sometimes appear in subsequent government policies and international agreements. Whether this represents the natural influence of good ideas or coordinated implementation of predetermined agendas depends largely on your perspective about how policy development actually works in practice. The group's evolution from Cold War strategic planning to contemporary economic coordination illustrates how elite networking mechanisms adapt to changing geopolitical circumstances while maintaining their essential function of facilitating informal communication among influential individuals. Whether this represents beneficial international cooperation or inappropriate Circumvention of democratic processes remains a subject of ongoing political debate. The Council on Foreign Relations represents yet another institutional mechanism through which dynastic influence networks can coordinate their activities and shape public policy. Founded in 1921, the Council has included members from virtually every major American dynastic family, creating a platform for ongoing policy discussion and strategic coordination that operates parallel to official government channels. The Council's publications, conferences, and policy recommendations have influenced American foreign policy for nearly a century, though the extent of that influence and its appropriateness within democratic governance structures remains debated among foreign policy experts and political scientists. Whether the Council represents beneficial expertise or inappropriate elite control over foreign policy depends largely on your perspective about the relationship between private expertise and public decision-making. Here's a detail that illustrates how these influence networks operate in practice. Council on Foreign Relations members have served in senior government positions under both Republican and Democratic administrations, creating continuity in foreign policy approaches that transcends partisan political changes. Whether this represents beneficial expertise and institutional memory or inappropriate insulation of policymaking from democratic accountability depends on your perspective about how government should actually work. The Council's role in developing concepts like globalization, humanitarian intervention, and responsibility to protect demonstrates how elite policy networks can shape the intellectual frameworks that guide government decision-making. These concepts influence how political leaders think about international relations and domestic policy, creating ideological foundations that shape specific policy decisions across multiple administrations and countries. You feel your muscles relaxing as you contemplate how these various institutional mechanisms, the World Economic Forum, Bilderberg Group, Council on Foreign Relations, and numerous similar organizations, create opportunities for the kind of informal coordination that could theoretically enable coordinated dynastic influence without requiring explicit conspiracy or formal agreements. Your consciousness drifts through the twilight realm where individual dynastic influence converges into something larger and more complex than the sum of its parts, and you find yourself contemplating the concept of deep state coordination not as crude conspiracy theory, but as the natural result of how institutional relationships and personal networks create persistent policy continuities that transcend electoral changes and partisan divisions. The term deep state has been weaponized by various political movements, but the underlying concept describes something more mundane and perhaps more concerning than dramatic conspiracy theories suggest. It refers to the network of institutional relationships, personal connections, and shared assumptions that create policy continuities regardless of which political party holds formal power. Whether this represents beneficial institutional stability or inappropriate insulation from democratic accountability depends largely on your perspective about how governance should actually work. Consider how senior officials move between government positions, corporate boards, think tank fellowships, and academic appointments, creating what political scientists call a revolving door of influence that maintains relationships and policy approaches across different institutional contexts. Former Treasury secretaries become investment bank executives. Former defense secretaries join defense contractor boards. Former CIA directors become consulting firm partners, creating networks of mutual obligation and shared interest that persist regardless of electoral outcomes. These career patterns aren't necessarily coordinated or conspiratorial, but they create structural incentives for policy continuity that can frustrate democratic attempts to change direction. When the same individuals and their protégés cycle through key positions across multiple administrations, policy changes become incremental rather than transformational, regardless of campaign promises or electoral mandates. Here's a detail that might make you reflect on how these networks actually operate. Henry Kissinger served as Secretary of State under Republican President Nixon, then continued as an informal foreign policy advisor to subsequent presidents of both parties for decades afterward. His consulting firm, Kissinger Associates, provided strategic advice to multinational corporations while he maintained influence over government policy through personal relationships and institutional positions. Whether this represents beneficial expertise or inappropriate blending of public and private interests depends on your perspective about conflicts of interest and democratic accountability. The Kissinger example illustrates how individual influence can become institutionalized across multiple decades and political administrations. His approach to foreign policy, emphasizing realpolitik over ideological considerations, became embedded in foreign policy institutions regardless of whether Republican or Democratic presidents held office. Whether this represents beneficial continuity or inappropriate insulation from democratic change remains debated among foreign policy experts and political scientists. As you drift deeper toward sleep, consider how financial regulatory agencies demonstrate similar patterns of institutional continuity that transcend partisan political changes. The Federal Reserve, Securities and Exchange Commission, and Treasury Department maintain relationships with major financial institutions that create policy approaches favoring financial stability over structural change. Regardless of which political party controls the White House or Congress, the 2008 financial crisis response illustrates how these institutional relationships can shape policy outcomes in ways that protect established interests while claiming to serve broader public purposes. The decision to bail out major financial institutions while allowing homeowners to face foreclosure reflected institutional priorities that had been developing for decades through the revolving door relationships between regulatory agencies and financial industry executives. Whether this response represented necessary crisis management or inappropriate protection of elite interests remains debated among economists and political scientists. But what's undeniable is how institutional relationships and shared assumptions shaped policy choices that had enormous consequences for millions of people. The same regulatory officials who had previously worked for major banks made decisions that protected those banks' interests while imposing costs on taxpayers and homeowners. The Federal Reserve's role in this process demonstrates how supposedly independent institutions can become captured by the industries they're meant to regulate. Fed officials maintain close relationships with major bank executives, attend the same conferences, share similar educational backgrounds, and often move between Fed positions and financial industry jobs. Whether this creates beneficial expertise or inappropriate regulatory capture depends on your perspective about the relationship between regulators and the industries they oversee. Intelligence agencies represent another institutional area where personal networks and shared assumptions can create policy. continuities that transcend electoral changes and partisan divisions. CIA directors, NSA officials, and FBI executives often maintain relationships with defense contractors, technology companies, and foreign policy think tanks that create structural incentives for expanding surveillance capabilities and military interventions regardless of campaign promises about civil liberties or peaceful foreign policy. The intelligence community's response to various reform efforts illustrates how institutional networks can resist democratic attempts to change policy directions, whether these responses represent necessary protection of national security capabilities or inappropriate resistance to democratic oversight depends largely on your perspective about the balance between security and accountability in democratic governance. Here's a detail that demonstrates how these networks operate across partisan divisions. John Brennan served as CIA director under Democratic President Obama, while Mike Pompeo served in the same position under Republican President Trump, yet both maintained similar approaches to surveillance programs, drone warfare, and intelligence cooperation with foreign governments. Whether this represents beneficial institutional continuity or inappropriate insulation from democratic change remains hotly debated among civil liberties advocates and national security experts. The military-industrial complex represents perhaps the most visible example of how institutional relationships can create policy continuities that serve established interests regardless of electoral outcomes. Defense contractors maintain relationships with Pentagon officials, congressional staff members, and think tank researchers that create structural incentives for military spending and foreign interventions that persist across different political administrations. You feel your breathing deepen as you contemplate how these various institutional networks, financial regulatory agencies, intelligence services, defense establishments, and foreign policy institutions create opportunities for the kind of coordinated influence that dynastic families could theoretically exercise without requiring explicit conspiracy or formal coordination agreements. Your mind floats through the misty borderland between documented influence and speculative coordination, where the concept of manufactured consent emerges like a half-remembered dream that explains too much to be comfortable. The phrase, coined by political theorist Noam Chomsky, describes how media systems can shape public opinion in ways that serve elite interests without requiring direct censorship or explicit coordination, a more subtle and perhaps more effective form of information control than crude propaganda or obvious manipulation. The manufacturing consent model suggests that media organizations naturally tend to support perspectives that align with their owners' interests, their advertisers' preferences, and their sources' agendas, creating systematic biases that favor established power structures without requiring conscious conspiracy or coordinated planning. Whether this represents inevitable structural influence or manipulative information control depends largely on your perspective about how media systems actually operate in practice. Consider how major media organizations are owned by corporations that have extensive business relationships with the same industries and institutions they're supposed to cover objectively. When General Electric owned NBC, the network's coverage of nuclear power issues reflected the parent company's business interests. When Disney owns ABC, the network's coverage of intellectual property issues tends to support Disney's policy preferences. These influences operate through structural incentives rather than explicit editorial directives, making them more difficult to identify and resist than obvious. Propaganda, the revolving door between media organizations and government agencies, creates additional structural incentives for coverage that supports established policy approaches rather than challenging them. Former government officials become television commentators, former journalists become government press secretaries, and media executives move between news organizations and political campaigns, creating networks of mutual obligation and shared assumption that shape coverage in subtle but persistent ways. Here's a detail that might make you reflect on how these influence networks actually operate. During the lead-up to the Iraq War, major media organizations relied heavily on government sources and think tank experts who supported military intervention, while giving less coverage to critics who questioned the intelligence claims and strategic assumptions underlying the war rationale, whether this represented patriotic support for government policy or manipulative preparation for predetermined military action remains debated among media critics and foreign policy analysts. The Iraq war coverage illustrates how structural biases can create the appearance of independent journalism while actually serving established interests. Media organizations weren't explicitly told to support the war, but their reliance on official sources, their owners' business interests, and their audiences' patriotic sentiments created natural incentives for coverage that supported rather than challenged government policy. As you drift deeper into the soft embrace of sleep, consider how social media platforms have created new opportunities for both grassroots, democratic participation, and sophisticated manipulation of public opinion. The same technologies that enable ordinary citizens to share information and organize political activities also enable wealthy individuals and organizations to influence public discourse through targeted advertising, algorithmic manipulation, and coordinated messaging campaigns. The Cambridge Analytica scandal illustrates how modern information warfare operates through data analysis and targeted messaging rather than traditional propaganda techniques. The company's ability to influence voter behavior through personalized political advertising based on psychological profiling represents a new frontier in political manipulation that combines traditional influence techniques with technology and data analysis. Whether social media platforms represent democratizing technologies or sophisticated manipulation tools depends largely on how they're used and regulated. The same platforms that enable grassroots organizing and citizen journalism also enable foreign interference, domestic manipulation, and the spread of disinformation that can undermine democratic decision-making processes. The tech platforms' content moderation policies demonstrate how private companies have acquired quasi-governmental powers over public discourse without corresponding democratic accountability. When Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube decide which content to promote, suppress, or remove, they're making editorial decisions that can influence electoral outcomes and policy debates. Yet these decisions are made by private companies based on their own commercial and ideological interests rather than democratic processes. The relationship between tech platforms and government agencies creates additional opportunities for indirect censorship and information control that operates through private companies rather than direct government action. When government officials pressure social media companies to remove certain content or adjust their algorithms, the resulting censorship can be more effective than direct government action, because it appears to be private, corporate decision-making. rather than government suppression of speech? Here's a detail that illustrates how modern information control operates during the COVID-19 pandemic. Social media platforms coordinated with government health agencies to suppress information that contradicted official public health messaging, regardless of whether that information came from credible medical experts or scientific studies, whether this represented responsible public health communication or inappropriate censorship of legitimate scientific debate remains hotly contested among medical professionals and free speech advocates. The pandemic response also demonstrated how public health emergencies can be used to justify expanded government powers and reduced democratic accountability that persist long after the original crisis has passed. Emergency powers that were supposed to be temporary often become permanent. Surveillance programs that were supposed to be limited often become routine, and censorship policies that were supposed to be exceptional often become standard operating procedures. Educational institutions represent another arena where systematic influence can shape public opinion and policy preferences across generations. When major universities receive substantial donations from wealthy families and corporations, their research priorities, faculty hiring decisions, and curriculum development can be influenced in ways that serve donor interests rather than purely academic considerations. The influence of dynastic philanthropy on higher education creates long-term opportunities for shaping how future leaders think about economic policy, social organization, and political priorities. When business schools teach theories that favor free market policies, when policy schools promote approaches that benefit established interests, and when journalism schools train students in practices that serve corporate media preferences, these educational influences can shape public discourse for decades, through the graduates who become business leaders, government officials, and media professionals. The relationship between university, research, and corporate funding creates additional opportunities for systematic influence over the production of knowledge that informs public policy debates. When pharmaceutical companies fund medical research, when energy companies fund climate studies, and when technology companies fund computer science programs, the resulting research can be influenced by funding sources in ways that serve commercial rather than purely scientific interests. Whether these influences represent beneficial private support for education and research or inappropriate manipulation of academic independence depends largely on your perspective about the relationship between private funding and intellectual freedom. What's undeniable is that these funding relationships create structural incentives that can shape research priorities and conclusions in ways that serve donor interests rather than broader public purposes. You feel your muscles relaxing as you contemplate how these various influence mechanisms, media, ownership, social media manipulation, educational philanthropy, and research funding create opportunities for systematic shaping of public opinion that operates through structural incentives rather than explicit coordination or conscious conspiracy. Your consciousness drifts now through the final corridors of this labyrinthian exploration, where all the threads of dynastic influence, institutional coordination, and systematic control begin to weave together into a tapestry that's both more complex and more mundane than the dramatic conspiracy theories would suggest. You find yourself floating in that liminal space between sleep and waking, where the boundaries between documented history and speculative possibility blur like watercolors in gentle rain. The 13 families whether you count them as Rothschild, Rockefeller, Morgan, DuPont, Bush, Windsor, Habsburg, Warburg, Oppenheimer, or any of the other dynastic names that have surfaced in our journey, represent not so much a coordinated conspiracy as a natural phenomenon of how wealth and influence operate across time. Like rivers finding their way to the sea, money and power flow through the channels of least resistance, creating patterns that appear coordinated even when they're simply following the gravitational pull of accumulated advantage. You settle deeper into your pillow as you consider how these families have adapted their influence strategies across centuries of technological change, political upheaval, and social transformation. The Rothschilds evolved from European banking to global finance. The Rockefellers transitioned from oil to philanthropy. The tech dynasties compressed centuries of influence accumulation into decades of platform control. Each adaptation represents not conscious conspiracy, but intelligent evolution, the natural behavior of successful organisms in changing environments. The institutional mechanisms we've explored, the World Economic Forum, Bilderberg Group, Council on Foreign Relations, and countless similar organizations, create opportunities for coordination without requiring explicit agreement. When people with similar interests, backgrounds, and objectives gather regularly to discuss common challenges, they naturally develop shared approaches and mutual support networks. Whether this represents beneficial cooperation or inappropriate coordination depends largely on whether you're included in these networks or excluded from them. The revolving door between government, business, academia, and media creates persistent policy continuities that can frustrate democratic attempts at change while serving established interests. But these continuities emerge from structural incentives rather than conspiratorial planning. When the same people cycle through key positions across different institutions, they naturally maintain relationships and approaches that transcend partisan political changes. Here's perhaps the most important insight from our nocturnal journey. The real power of dynastic families lies not in their ability to control events directly, but in their capacity to shape the systems within which events unfold. They don't need to determine specific outcomes if they can influence the rules, institutions, and assumptions that guide how decisions get made. It's like being able to design the game board rather than simply moving pieces around it. The manufacturing of consent operates through structural biases rather than explicit censorship, creating information environments that naturally favors certain perspectives while marginalizing others. Social media algorithms, educational curricula, research funding priorities, and media ownership patterns all contribute to systematic shaping of public opinion that serves established interests without requiring conscious coordination or explicit manipulation. As your breathing slows and your muscles release their final tension, consider how this understanding changes your relationship to the information you consume, the institutions you trust, and the democratic processes you participate in. The conspiracy isn't that 13 families meet in secret rooms to control world events. It's that wealth and influence naturally concentrate and self-perpetuate through mechanisms that operate below the threshold of public awareness and democratic accountability. The patterns we've explored suggest that meaningful change requires not just electoral victories or policy reforms, but systematic transformation of the institutional structures that enable dynastic influence to persist across generations. And political changes whether such transformation is possible within existing democratic frameworks or requires more fundamental restructuring remains an open question that each generation must answer for itself. Your eyelids grow heavy as you contemplate the ultimate irony. The very systems that enable democratic participation, communication, media, political institutions, economic markets can be shaped by the same dynastic influences they're supposed to regulate and constrain. It's not that democracy doesn't work, but that it operates within parameters that are themselves influenced by the accumulated advantages of wealth and power. The 13 families, whether they exist as conscious conspiracy or natural phenomenon, represent something deeper than individual greed or political ambition. They embody the tendency of complex systems to develop persistent patterns of advantage that resist democratic attempts at redistribution or reform. Understanding these patterns doesn't require believing in elaborate conspiracies, it simply requires recognizing how power actually operates in practice, rather than how we imagine it should work in theory. As sleep finally claims your consciousness, you drift away with the understanding that the most effective forms of control are often the most invisible ones, not dramatic coercion, but subtle influence, not obvious manipulation, but structural bias, not explicit conspiracy, but convergent interests pursuing parallel paths toward similar destinations. The boring history of power is ultimately more concerning than the exciting theories about it, because boring systems persist while exciting conspiracies eventually collapse under their own dramatic weight. In your final moments of awareness, you recognize that knowledge of these patterns creates both responsibility and opportunity. The responsibility to remain skeptical of simple explanations and comfortable assumptions, and the opportunity to participate more thoughtfully in the democratic processes that, despite their limitations and vulnerabilities, remain our best hope for creating more equitable and accountable systems of governance. The soft hum of your fan mingles with the gentle rhythm of your breathing as you surrender to sleep, carrying with you not paranoid fear about secret cabals, but thoughtful awareness about how influence actually operates in the complex, interconnected world we all navigate together. Sweet dreams, fellow traveler, in the endless quest to understand how power works and how it might work better.